Now, in part one, we mostly talked about representation in the mind, representation of the mental process, representation of the external world, of the bodily sensations, emotions, etc. We talked about the neurons and neural circuits that participate in that representation and used the analogy of a camera, a photo camera or video camera. Now, in this part, I would like to focus more on the cognition part, on the activity of the mind, and see if we can build any kind of a bridge between neurons and cognition, between brain and mind. First, let's consider the dictionary definitions of cognition. The Cambridge Dictionary defines cognition as the use of conscious mental processes. And it uses the following phrase as an example of a sentence that uses the word cognition, is that for even if features of the world were literally represented in brains, minds, these representations would not explain cognition. So part one was not enough. Let's consider how the cognitive process may work and how can we understand how it works. The Oxford University Dictionary defines cognition a bit more broadly, uses more words, as a mental action or process of acquiring knowledge and understanding through thought, experience, and the senses. Neuroscience is a hard science, not just because it deals with the hard problems such as consciousness, cognition, human psychology, and connection between brain and mind, but also because it uses the tools developed by other hard sciences, physics, mathematics. I am trained as a biophysicist, and it's an extremely helpful background to have physics and apply the physics tools to studying biology. This is why I thought I would give you an extensive quote from Arthur Eddington, who was a contemporary of Einstein and made an important contribution to astronomy and physics and mathematics. And let's see what he had to say about our cognitive process in the framework of physics and mathematics. And you can make a pause in this presentation and read it for yourself, and then I will continue by drawing your attention to some parts of this quote. What I think is important to notice in this quote is that already a century ago, in the beginning of the 20th century, with the great advances of physics towards the general relativity and quantum mechanics, the naive Victorian era kind of mental representation of matter and atoms and physical objects as something that objectively exists, whether or not there is a conscious observer, has been dismissed. And in fact, experiments like the dual slit experiment that I don't have time to go into now shows demonstrably and repeatedly that there's no such thing as a particle unless there is a conscious observer paying attention to it, unless there is a measurement. Otherwise, there's just a wave function that is an immaterial field of probabilities. So this naive representation of matter as concrete physical objects is not standing in physics, and I can say that during the 100 years or so that passed since the Eddington quote, we have just reinforced this understanding of the conscious observation dependent existence of material objects such as atomic particles. So as we proceed with this lecture, we need to keep in mind that all we are dealing with is more of a mental representation, a model that we have in our minds of material objects such as the brain, the neurons, the molecules, the receptors, the atoms, the particles, etc. Now, let's recap what we discussed in part 1. The model where there is a real-world object and the observer, the subject, through cognition, perceives the world with, of course, some distortions and some memories overlapped on it, and the emotional coloring, etc. But let's consider also a different perspective, which was developed in the last 20 years or so. And Carl Friston of University College London has been instrumental in moving this view forward. It's actually a view that is in a sense close to the closed loop camera recording idea, but goes even beyond that. It's the idea that our mind constantly projects the pre-existing knowledge and the internal model of the world onto the process of perception of the world. As summarized in this funny cartoon, we are constantly projecting our reality and viewing it back. Of course, it's not a completely idiotic and fake process of creating our reality, because there is always an error correction mechanism. And I'll explain it a little bit further as we go with this lecture. So, how does this mechanism work? The predictive coding mechanism that was developed in the last 20 years or so and championed by Carl Friston suggests that there is a constant flow of information, of neuronal signaling in the top-down direction, which imposes the pre-existing hypothetical model kind of information on to the sensory inputs that we get from the external world. And that these two flows of information, the top-down as a prediction, and the bottom-up flow information as the prediction error information, is a constant process that is in balance, is a kind of a dynamic equilibrium that pursues a single goal of pretty much saving energy. So the diagram on the right symbolizes the free energy landscape and the specific rhythms in the brain, the alpha rhythms, that can have more or less of these maxima and minima, and the minimization of these free energy that needs to be spent is the basic principle behind the predictive coding. But before proceeding, I guess I would need to make an appeal to authorities and explain who Carl Friston is, just like we appeal to the authority of Darwin or Ivan Pavlov or other great authorities in neurosciences. One needs to consider that academic science, being a human organization, is built on authority and references. So Carl Friston, as you can read in this quote, is a member of Royal Society, and at his nomination in 2014, this is what has been said about him, and I quote, "None has had as major an influence as Friston on the development of human brain studies in the past 25 years." So Carl Friston is clearly an authority. He has developed the methods that we use now to understand how the brain works and how the mind maybe emerges from the brain activity. And that's one of the questions that Carl Friston himself is puzzled with. And in this paper in Nature Neuroscience, Carl Friston refers to a specific paper that was published at the turn of the century that sort of turned the idea of brain-mind connection upside down, or it produced a strange inversion, as he puts it. And it truly was a paradigm shift. Again, I'll make a pause so you can read the quote completely. But what's important here is that the brain constantly seems to be making predictions about the world, projecting these predictions onto the sensory input and correcting its model, its idea about the world based on the feedback. So it's a constant adjustment process which has a single purpose, apparently, to minimize the prediction error and to maximize the evidence for the brain's model of the world. Interestingly, I would note here that this is how science works as well. It makes theoretical predictions about the world and then performs measurements, as we said before, based on disturbing the system, moving it out of the equilibrium and observing the relaxation back to the equilibrium state, and this way learning about the system intrinsic properties. And this then is used as a correction mechanism to minimize the prediction error and to adjust the models, the theories that we have about the world. An interesting thing that Professor Friston notes about the predictive coding in this Nature Neuroscience paper is that it can be translated into the languages of other disciplines, not necessarily closely connected to neurosciences. For example, in statistics, in machine learning, in engineering, information theory, it can be described in those languages, but pretty much the principle is all the same, which in Carl Friston's terms is variational free energy. Let us consider some practical illustrations of the predictive coding, how this works on your personal mind, how it tricks your brain into believing the things that you are not really seeing. When you look at this mask, consider that this is just a three-dimensional rotating face mask, which turns itself towards the viewer interchangeably with its concave and convex sides. So this is how we should see it, right? So first we should see the face as if it were convex, and then as if it were concave. But this is not the case. No matter how hard you try, your brain will always flip the image very quickly after the mask turns around, and it will refuse to perceive the face as a concave figure. It will insist in your conscious perception that the face is convex. So the brain enforces its internal model based on the memory, based on the prior experience that faces are always convex. It insists that what you're seeing is not true, and it sort of overrides, projects its idea onto your perception and overrides the sensory input that you have. Another beautiful example of predictive coding in action is the famous phenomenon of binocular rivalry that has been observed a long time ago, and it still is quite puzzling. The phenomenon is very simple. Is when you project two different images, sufficiently different, let's say two different colors and different shapes, onto the left eye and the right eye simultaneously, instead of getting a binocular overlap of the two visual fields, as would be expected from a machine that accurately represents the objective reality, the brain flips and flops between the two images. It either perceives consciously the left eye image or the right eye image, but not both at the same time. And this is another illustration from a more recent paper that shows in a diagram that there is an inhibition, an active neuronal inhibition that is like a rivalry indeed between the two networks, one of which supposedly encodes the hypothesis for the left eye view, the other one encodes the hypothesis for the right eye view, and they are incompatible, so therefore the brain makes a decision to either consciously perceive one of them or the other, but not both at the same time. And at this point, I'd like to quote my favorite philosopher, Alan Watts, who unfortunately died in the 70s, a couple of years after I was born. The quote is that human consciousness is not just a form of awareness, sensitivity, and understanding. It also is a form of ignorance, or as Alan Watts likes to put it, ignorance, because it ignores or leaves out more of the incoming information that it actually takes in. It's like a narrow bandpass filter that allows the information in. And I think binocular rivalry experiment illustrates this quite dramatically. And so this loop that goes on constantly between the predictive coding and the prediction era returning and correcting the predictive model is sort of kind of a strange loop that can lead to the idea of the nested reality or nested perception mechanism where, well, I come from Russia originally, so I like the Russian matryoshka analogy. You can also imagine the Chinese boxes that are sort of nested inside each other. So let's consider any kind of experiment, any experiential experiment that we can have. Let's say we're just looking at a matryoshka. It's a mesoscale object, meaning that it's comparable to our size. It's not a microscopic object. It's not a macroscopic or large, let's say, cosmological planetarian size object. So we can see and perceive it with our senses directly. And we use the sensory organs for this perception. And then the perception itself is occurring in the consciousness of the observer, in our consciousness, through the cognitive process. Okay, that's fair enough. Let's consider a thought experiment where you are hypothesizing something, putting it in mathematical terms, doing the calculations, purely mental experiment, a thought experiment. Again, it occurs inside your conscious awareness, inside your cognitive process. Now, perhaps you would say, maybe the microscopic analysis of the physical objects, such as atoms or molecules or receptors, when we study those, the process would be different. Well, let's follow the same logic. Here is a receptor in a molecule. We use our research equipment, such as a 2-photon microscope, to visualize an individual molecule in the living animal's brain. We then do the complex data analysis to represent this information so that it makes sense to us. And then finally, we are the conscious observer in the cognitive mind of which this information is perceived. So we're sort of trapped inside consciousness in a sense. And it is therefore very interesting to see the kind of binocular rivalry, if you will, if you want to put it this way, between the two views of the relationship between brain and mind, between consciousness and matter. We can say on the one hand that the brain and neurons and other physical objects are merely perceptions within our conscious minds. On the other hand, and this is the working hypothesis that neuroscience endorses today primarily, we believe that brain and neurons are complex enough and form complex networks with lots of feedback loops that are complex enough to generate an emergent property, something new that comes out of it, and that would be the consciousness and the mind and our cognitive ability. So which is which? Is it the brain inside the mind, or is it the mind inside the brain? At the moment we don't have an answer, but maybe both are true, and maybe we need to consider both. But knowing what we know today about how our mind works and how it projects its prior knowledge and its biases and its predictions onto the flow of sensory information that sometimes is reinforced by scientific equipment and analytical methods, but still it's the sensory input, which is heavily influenced by our prior knowledge and our predictions. We cannot say that the first model, where brain is inside the mind, is incorrect. We cannot say that the other model is incorrect either. And at this point, we can ask ourselves, what do we do? What can we do? Can we build a bridge between the mind and the brain and see which direction this relationship goes, bidirectional or unidirectional? Well, we have to, as professional researchers, as scientists, we have to use the tools that science has. And as we summarized it before, we can disturb the system somehow. And now we're talking about the cognitive process, the cognition, the consciousness of the subject, and see how the system returns back and what is the difference between the disturbed or deviated or stimulated cognition and the undisturbed, the normal waking consciousness. And we can use the same methods, the recording, electrophysiological, invasive or non-invasive, let's say EEG, MEG, recordings, the imaging methods on human subjects, and more invasively fluorescence methods on animals, where it's ethically permitted, and also observe their behavior and see how that changes. And this is the kind of the project that we are embarking soon in collaboration with the groups of Professor Eero Castrén and Professor Esa Korpi in testing the hypothesis that the readaptive plasticity of the nervous system can be studied using the tools that have not been available for research, or very limitedly, in a limited way, have been available for the last 50 years or so, the psychedelic substances such as LSD or psilocybin. And these are the cartoons from another paper by Carl Friston in collaboration with Robin Carhart-Harris, also in London at the Imperial College, where they present the psychedelics as a tool to disturb the conscious process, to move it out of the normal waking consciousness state, which is just one of the states in which our consciousness can be, and then observe the differences. And one of their hypotheses here that is supported by the data is that the free energy landscape is quite different under the action of psychedelics. And this is something that we want to study more mechanistically now in our animal experiments. And that's thus the collaboration with the Korpi and Castrén groups. And we will study this in the animal experiments in vigilo, in awake behaving animals. And the methods that we will be using are those that I will be presenting in the third and the fourth parts of this lecture. So stay tuned.